Thank you very much. Okay. The last time we were in Ezra, we considered the sovereignty of God in the decree of King Cyrus. We saw how holy God used a pagan king to return his people to the promised land and thereby fulfill his promises. We saw how God and his sovereignty worked in the hearts of people who would return. And so tonight we come to consider those who returns. For 42,360 to be exact. Now, if you look at that chapter at face value in your yearly reading Bible plan, you would be tempted to skip over it. You can sleep in this morning. If you read it, you maybe hop and skip from name to name at 1.5 speed just to tick a box and move on. But in God's providence, I was forced this week to study this chapter. And what emerges is a wonderful illustration of the faithfulness of God. Not just in big gestures of history, bringing King Cyrus of Persia to do God's will, but God's faithfulness in the small people, the everyday people, the people you've never heard of. People like you and me tonight. So in Ezra 2, tonight, we will be seeing how God is faithful in building his church, one ordinary person at a time. That brings us to the points which we'll consider tonight. We'll break up this monotonous passage in the following 7 points. Firstly, we'll look at the context of the faithfulness of God. Then the faithfulness of God towards Judah's leaders, that's going back. The faithfulness of God towards the everyday covenant people. The faithfulness of God displayed in the ministers of the temple, and also the faithfulness of God displayed in those who have compromised their identities. 6, we'll see the faithfulness of God displayed in the small number of people that actually return. And lastly, we'll see the hard response of the people towards the faithfulness of God. So tonight, first, let's start with the context. Before we get to the people, we need to be reminded of the context because it is important for us to understand the people that do return. In Ezra 2, verses 1, we read, "Now these are the people of the province who came up out of the captivity of the exile from Nebuchadnezzar. The king of Babylon, the king of Babylon had carried away to Babylon and returned to Jerusalem and Judah, each to his city." Firstly, we need to consider the place. The people are returning to the promised land, but this is not the mighty kingdom of David, the kingdom that stretched from the Red Sea to the Euphrates. This is not the splendor of the kingdom of Solomon that drew queens from Ethiopia to its courts. It is now simply described as the province. Yehut Midinata in Aramaic. That was the new Persian name for the province of Judah. And it just formed a small part of the satrapy of Ebernari of Persia, which just meant Aramaic for beyond the river. Indeed, this little province of Judah will never ever be a kingdom again. Under the Greeks, later on, Judah would be a small administrative district, part of the wider region of Kuli, Syria. Under the Romans, after the Bar Kokhba revolt in 100 years after Christ, Judah would be admonished, destroyed, and merged in with a province called Syria-Palestine. And that was intentional because it was named after the enemies of the Jews, the Philistines. And after those events, even Jerusalem was restored and rebuilt as a pagan city called Aelia Capitolonia. The people we are reading of tonight are not returning triumphantly to the grandeur of a lost kingdom. They're returning to the ruins of a provincial town, never ever to become a kingdom again. And yet, God is faithful in building his church that will endure forever. That brings us to the state of the place. The last time the Jews left Jerusalem, Jeremiah described it like this in 2 Kings 25, verses 8 to 12. Now on the 7th day of the 5th month, which was the 19th year of King Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, a servant of the king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem. He burned the house of the Lord, the king's house, and all the houses of Jerusalem. Even every great house he burned with fire. So all the army of the Chaldeans who were with the captain of the guard broke down the walls around Jerusalem. Then the rest of the people who were left in the city and the deserters who had deserted to the king of Babylon and the rest of the people, Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, carried away into exile. But the captain of the guard left some of the poorest of the land to be vine dressers and plowmen. That was 70 years before Ezra. So you could only imagine what Jerusalem looked like when they came back. Not only is Judea no longer a kingdom, but Jerusalem is a dump, a provincial backwater occupied by the poor and the weak and the unimportant. After 70 years, the people in Ezra 2 are leaving lives and livelihoods back in Persia to come home to a dump. Imagine a Ukrainian family living comfortably in New York, selling everything to return to Mariupol, a city flattened by war. Imagine a Somalian family who had rebuilt their lives in London, returning to war-torn Mogadishu. Imagine a Syrian family who has established a home in Berlin, returning to destroyed Aleppo. So these Jews are giving up everything, and they're returning with one mission in mind: to rebuild the temple of God. As we've seen in Ezra 1, verses 5, everyone whose spirit God had stirred to go up and rebuild the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem, the dump. So the people of God are returning to the promised land, not for their own advancement in life, but to rebuild the temple of God for the glory of God. And so, God is faithful in building his church. Which brings us to the second point: the faithfulness of God towards the leaders that come. Ezra 2, verses 2. These came with Zerubbabel, Yeshua, Nehemiah, Sariah, Reliah, Mordecai, Bilshan, Mispar, Bigvai, Rehum, and Banah. Of these listed here, two names in particular are important to us: Zerubbabel, the leader, and Yeshua, the high priest. We recognize two other names here, which is Nehemiah and Mordecai. But these are not the same people we encounter in Esther or in the book of Nehemiah. Because Mordecai is still in Susa during the book of Esther. It cannot be the same person. And Nehemiah will only come 13 years after Ezra. And so it's not the same Nehemiah. So why is Zerubbabel so significant to us? Because he is a direct descendant of David through his son Nathan. We find this lineage recorded for us in the Old Testament in 1 Chronicles 3. And why is that significant? Why is it so significant for the heir of David to return to Jerusalem? Because God made a covenant with David. 2 Samuel 7, verses 12 to 13. When your days are complete and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your descendant after you, who will become forth from you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. So in Zerubbabel, we see that throughout the splitting of the kingdoms, God preserved the line of David. Throughout Judah's apostasy, God preserved the line of David. Even through the exile in Babylon, God is still preserving the line of David. And here in Ezra 2, God continues the line of David. Not as a king. This is only a province in the Persian Empire after all. But the descendant of David remain, in order that God could fulfill his promise in another one to come much later. God is faithful in building his church. But there is another name that is significant to us. Yeshua. What is so significant about Yeshua? Because Yeshua, also called Joshua, is a direct descendant of Aaron. In Haggai 1 verses 1, we read, "In the second year of Darius the king, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came by the prophet Haggai to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, and a governor of Judah, and Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest." And in 1 Chronicles 6, we find his lineage, the lineage of Jehozadak, and it's traced right back to Aaron through his son Eleazar. Now, why is that important for us? Because in Yeshua, the sacrificial system can now resume, and the legitimacy of the priesthood can be restored. The temple could be built, but yes, sacrifices could also be made there. The high priest has returned. But that was not the ultimate goal of the priests returning either. It would only be a placeholder until what God said in 1 Samuel 2 verses 35 would come to pass. God speaks and he says, "But I will raise up for myself a faithful priest, who will do according to what is in my heart and in my soul, and I will build him an enduring house, and he will walk before my anointed ways." And likewise in Zechariah, the same is said in Zechariah 6 verses 11 to 14. "Take silver and gold and make an ornate crown and set it on the head of Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Then say to him, 'Thus says the Lord of hosts, behold, a man whose name is Branch. For he will branch out from where he is, and he will build the temple of the Lord. Yes, it is he who will build the temple of the Lord, and he will bear the honor and sit and rule on his throne. Thus he will be a priest on his throne, and the counsel of peace will be between the two offices." If you don't realize it, Zechariah is not talking about Yeshua here, but one will follow Yeshua in the future. And so in Yeshua, we see that throughout the splitting of the kingdoms, God is preserving the line of Aaron. Throughout Judah's apostasy, God is preserving the line of Aaron. Throughout the exile in Babylon, God is preserving the line of Aaron. And here in Ezra 2, God is continuing the line of Aaron. Not to re-establish the temple forever, but to maintain the law of God long enough for the perfect priest to fulfill all righteousness. And when the priest after the order of Melchizedek comes, he will combine the kingship of David and the priesthood of Aaron in one glorious crown, to rule over his people as king forever, and to serve his people as priest forever. See, God is faithful in building his church and maintaining these offices until one day the perfect one will take them both up. And that brings us to our third point. The faithfulness of God towards the everyday people. A persistent theme throughout the books of Ezra and then also Nehemiah are the common people. It's not just the royal line of David and the priestly line of Aaron that rebuilds the temple, but it's the common people too, people like you and I. The list below can be divided into two sections, and you'll see it. Verses 2 to 20 list the people according to their family names, and verses 21 to 35 lists them according to the places. And even in these lists, which I'm not going to read for your sake and mine, we find the faithfulness of God to build his church. Let me demonstrate that with 3 examples. We see God's faithfulness in Bethlehem. Look at verse 21. Verse 21 simply says, the men of Bethlehem, 123. Bethlehem will be so central and has been so central to God's redemptive plan. See, in Bethlehem, Rachel was buried in Genesis 35. In Bethlehem, Boaz redeemed Ruth in Ruth 4. In Bethlehem is where King David was anointed in 1 Samuel 16. And in Bethlehem, soon the prophet Micah will say the following. Micah 5, verses 2 to 4. But as for you, Bethlehem Ephratah, too little to be among the clans of Judah. From you one will go forth for me to be ruler in Israel. His goings forth are from long ago, from the days of eternity. Therefore he will give them up until the time when she who is in labor has borne a child. Then the remainder of his brethren will return to the sons of Israel, and he will arise and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord, in the majesty of the name of the Lord his God, and they will remain, because at that time he will be great to the ends of the earth. Here Micah is speaking about the same person that Zechariah spoke about, the great one to come, the great high priest, the great king. And so in Bethlehem, there is a promise of a covenant, a promise of redemption, a promise of an everlasting king. And in the return of 123 men to Bethlehem, the promises of God continues. And as God is faithful to maintaining his redemptive plan in Bethlehem, so God is faithful in building his church. Another example. We see God's faithfulness in Anathoth. Look at verse 23. The men of Anathoth, 128. Now, ever heard about Anathoth before tonight? I bet not. It is found in Jeremiah 32, and it's an amazing passage. Jeremiah is locked up in Jerusalem in this time by his own king, Zedekiah. He's locked up because he prophesied that the king will not survive the Chaldean attack, which was true. And King Nebuchadnezzar is outside the walls of Jerusalem, busy besieging it. The city will soon fall, and the situation is desperate. Jerusalem is on fire. Mothers are eating their children because they're so hungry. And soon everyone will either be killed or carted away to a land they've never ever seen before. But God comes to Jeremiah with a business proposition. Jeremiah 32, verses 8 to 10. Then Hanamel, my uncle's son, came to me in the court of the guard according to the word of the Lord and said to me, buy my field, please, that is in Anathoth, which is in the land of Benjamin, for you have the right of possession, and the redemption is yours, buy it for yourself. Then I knew that this was the word of the Lord. I bought the field which was at Anathoth from Hanamel, my uncle's son, and I weighed out the silver for him, 17 shekels of silver. I signed and sealed the deed and called it in witness and weighed out the silver on the scales. Now, I'm not a real estate expert, but that was probably not the best buy ever. The enemy is at the gate. The city is on fire. They will soon be taken into captivity for 70 years. This is not the time to buy property. And yet in this transaction, there's a promise from God. Jeremiah 32, verses 42 to 43. For thus says the Lord, just as I brought all this great disaster on this people, so I'm going to bring them all the good that I am promising them. Fields will be bought in this land, of which you say, it is a desolation, without man or beast. It is given into the hands of the Chaldeans. In the field of Anathoth, there is a promise of restoration, even the promise of returning to normal, a promise of faithfulness beyond which we can logically or rationally expect. And in the return of 128 men to Anathoth, these promises are fulfilled. And God is And as God is faithful in restoring the property market in Anathoth, how much more will God not be faithful in building his church? Lastly, we see the faithfulness in Bethel and Ai. Look at verse 28. The men of Bethel and Ai, 223. In Genesis 12, as Abram enters into the promised land, this is the first place he sets up an altar between the towns of Bethel and Ai. In Joshua 8, when the Israelites claim the land, it is between Bethel and Ai that they are initially defeated. And it's between Bethel and Ai that they learn that they will have to depend upon God to possess the land. And so, in Bethel and Ai, there is a promise of a covenant that is restored, the promise of a land, the promise of faithfulness, and the return of 223 men to Bethel and to Ai. The promise of God is restored as the people can once again take ownership of the promised land. And if God is faithful in restoring his promises to Abraham, God is definitely faithful in building his church. And so much more can be said of the faithfulness of God in these names. Netophath, and Shephariah, and Beeroth, and Ramah, and Geba, and Michmash, and Nebu, and Lod, and Hadid, and Ono, and Jericho. God's faithfulness is demonstrated in each one of these names. But let's move on to Ezra 2, verses 36 to 63. As we come to the faithfulness of God displayed in the ministers of the temple. Now, in these verses, we find four groups of people. The priests are named in verses 36 to 39. The Levites in verses 40 to 42. The temple servants in verses 43 to 54. And the sons of Solomon's servants in verses 55 to 59. Let's first start with the priests. Ezra 2, verses 36 to 38 says the following. The priests, the son of Dedaiah, the house of Jeshua, 973. The sons of Immer, 1,052. The sons of Pashur, 1,247. The sons of Harim, 1,017. Now, in comparison to those returning, the priests makes up a big contingent of those who are returning. They're about 10% of everyone that returns to Jerusalem under Ezra. But the names listed here represents only about 4 out of the 24 divisions that was established under King David and is listed in 1 Chronicles 24. Like Yeshua, these priests were direct descendants of Aaron. And as we've seen with Yeshua, they were essential to restore the worship at the temple, necessary eventually to fulfill all righteousness. The sheer amount of priests in this first company shows the focus of the expedition, and that is to rebuild the temple and to restore temple worship. In contrast to this, there is the next group, the Levites. We find them in Ezra 2, verses 40 to 42. The Levites, the son of Yeshua and Gatmiel, the sons of Hodaviah, the singers of the sons of Asaph, 128. The sons of the gatekeepers, the sons of Shallum, the sons of Ater, the sons of Talmon, the sons of Akub, the sons of Atita, and the sons of Shobai, in all 139. Before the exile, the number of Levites from the tribe of Levi vastly outnumbered the amount of priests, who were descendants of only one man, Aaron. According to 1 Chronicles 23, verses 3, the Levites were about 38,000 before the captivity. But at this first initial return, there's only 341 Levites that return. And these were the deacons of the temple. They led worship. They secured the gates. They were the administrators and the treasurers. But only 341 of them returned. That's a minuscule number. Not nearly enough to perform all the services that they were supposed to perform. And so we see, even in the return to the temple, that the system is already broken. We need to be reminded that the priests themselves were corrupted even before the captivity. And we see this in Jeremiah 20, verses 1 to 2, and then also 6. In the account of Pashur, he's one of the names we see in this genealogy. And where it says, when Pashur the priest, the son of Immer, who was chief officer in the house of the Lord, heard Jeremiah prophesying these things, Pashur had Jeremiah the prophet beaten and put him in stocks that were at the upper Benjamin gate, which was by the house of the Lord. And so Jeremiah says, you, Pashur, and all who live in your house will go into captivity, and you will enter Babylon, and there you will die, and there you will be buried, you and all your friends to whom you have falsely prophesied. The Levites aren't coming back. They're 341. The priests that come back in a tainted office. And yet, even with a tainted priesthood and a diminished Levitical order, God is sending his people back to restore the temple. In the return of a failed priesthood to once again serve in the temple of God, God is demonstrating his faithfulness to his people. In the diminished number of Levites returning to the temple, God is demonstrating his faithfulness despite the lack of Levites returning. This is not an ideal situation. The temple service as it was known before cannot be restored. And yet, God demonstrates his faithfulness in building his church. Which brings us to the next group of temple ministers, adequately called the temple servants. These were lower rank workers in the temple. They were the ones serving underneath the Levites. They were woodcutters and water carriers. Their origin goes all the way to the beginnings of the Promised Land, when the Israelites entered into the Promised Land. And when they entered, God commanded them not to make treaties with the inhabitants, but rather to destroy them all. And yet, in Joshua 9, the Gibeonites tricked Joshua into making a covenant with them, and therefore he could not destroy them. But when he discovered their true identity, he cursed them, and he cursed them to become slaves in the temple. Joshua 9, verses 22 to 23. Then Joshua called for them and spoke to them, saying, why have you deceived us, saying, we are very far from you, when you are living within our land? Now therefore, you are cursed, and you shall never cease being slaves, both hewers of wood and drawers of water in the house of my God. The descendants of those slaves are the very people who are now returning to the temple to serve once more. Similar, we find more people in the temple. These are the sons of Solomon's servants. These people have their origin during the time of Solomon. In 1 Kings 9, verses 20 to 21, we find their account. As for all the people who were left of the Amorites and the Hittites and the Perizzites and the Hivites and the Jebusites, were not of the sons of Israel. Their descendants who were left after them in the land, whom the sons of Israel were unable to destroy utterly. From them Solomon levied forced laborers, even to this day. Like the Gibeonites, these are foreigners. These are Canaanites. You can even see it in the foreignness of their names in these genealogies. But if there was ever a time to be free from the oppression of Israel, to be free of their menial position in Judah, now is the time. Now they could just stay in Persia, as many of the Levites apparently did. Now they could be free. And yet these descendants of those slaves are the very people who returned to rebuild the temple and serve there once more. There are 392 of them, even more than the Levites who came back. And the Levites were privileged among the sons of Israel. And in these servants, sons of foreign slaves, God demonstrates his faithfulness. His faithfulness in showing us that it's not the pedigree of Aaron or membership of the tribe of Levi that saves us, but God's grace that draws people from every tongue and tribe and nation to serve him. As Hosea prophesied in Hosea 2, verses 23, I will sow her for myself in the land. I will also have compassion on her who had not obtained compassion. And I will say to those who are not my people, you are my people. And they will say, you are my God. In the faithfulness and grace God shows towards foreign slaves, God demonstrates his faithfulness in building his church. That brings us to our fifth point. The faithfulness of God displayed in those with compromised identities. Ezra 2, verses 59 to 60. Now these are those who came up from Tel Melah, Tel Harsha, Cherub, Addan, and Immer. But they were not able to give evidence of their fathers' households and their descendants, whether they were of Israel. The sons of Delia, the sons of Tobiah, the sons of Nekoda, 652. God demonstrates his faithfulness to those who have compromised identities by no fault of their own. These are peoples without passports. They've lost their documentation. They are without a genealogy. People who cannot trace their belonging back to anyone in particular. They cannot trace their lineage back to Parosh, nor to a place like Anathoth. They cannot claim Aaron as their grandfather, or Levi as their people. They cannot even tell a story of subjugation by Joshua, like the Gibeonites, or of capture by Solomon, like the servants of Solomon can say. These people are nobodies. They belong nowhere. And yet, God demonstrates his faithfulness by including these nobodies. He's including them in a genealogy along great names like Zerubbabel, the descendant of David, and Yeshua, the descendant of Aaron. And the genealogies of those who are returning to rebuild the temple and to restore worship. These nobodies are included. And if God is faithful towards these nobodies, God is faithful in building his church. So God demonstrates his faithfulness to those who have compromised identities to no fault of their own. But God also demonstrates his faithfulness to those who have compromised identities, the fault of which is completely their own. In verse 61 we read, of the sons of the priests, the sons of Abiah, the sons of Hakos, and the sons of Barzillai, who took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and he was called by their name. These searched among their ancestral registration, but they could not be located. Therefore, they were considered unclean and excluded from the priesthood. Now let me explain what's going on here. In order for any priest to serve in the temple, they had to prove that they came from the line of Aaron. But these sons, the sons of Abiah, of Hakos, and Barzillai, could not find their records, and therefore they could not prove their lineage. Now, for the sons of Abiah and Hakos, there might have been some events outside of their control, but not so for the sons of Barzillai. Theirs were a willful compromise of identity, and it's explained to us in verse 61. See, they took a wife from the daughters of Barzillai, the Gileadite, and he was called by their name. Barzillai was a national hero. We read of him in 1 Samuel 17 and then also 1 Samuel 19. And there he supported David during the rebellion of Absalom. And so great was his support that David regarded him as a very close friend with great affection. And on his deathbed, David made a request from his son Solomon in 1 Kings 2 verses 7. But show kindness to the sons of Barzillai the Gileadite, and let them be among those who eat at your table, for they assisted me when I fled from your brother Absalom. So, to be called a son of Barzillai the Gileadite brought great prestige, even a seat at the table of the king. And this worldly position was so enticing that a man out of the line of Aaron, a priest, would give up his priestly lineage, his divine calling, to be regarded by men, and thereby be known as a son of Barzillai, the Gileadite. These are men that compromise their own identities in the pursuit of worldly acclaim. But God demonstrates his faithfulness to those who have compromised identities. Because while they're experiencing the consequences of their actions, they too are included in this genealogy of those who are returning to rebuild the temple. And if God can demonstrate his faithfulness towards those who compromise their own identities with the world, then God will be faithful in rebuilding his church as well. The section concludes with a judgment of hope. In verse 63, we read, "The governor said to them that they should not eat from the most holy things until a priest stood up with Urim and Thummim." One thing could change their fate. One thing could override the genealogy: the very revelation of God. Two things to be understood from this verse. Firstly, although their legitimacy is in question, they're not excluded from the people of God. But in order to avoid sin, these men are excluded from the ministry as priests. This time, the worship in the temple would be taken very, very seriously. And any minister, any priest that will serve there will be under great scrutiny. Secondly, there is only one thing that can establish their legitimacy, and that is the Urim and the Thummim. In other words, direct revelation from God. These were two stones, and we read of them at the establishment of the tabernacle. One stone of black and one stone of white. And it would be carried in the pocket of the high priest. The high priest would use these stones to obtain revelation from God. For example, drawing the white stone would mean that they are legitimate descendants of Aaron. Drawing the black stone would mean that they are not. Heads or tails. And through God's providence, God would reveal his will through the Urim and the Thummim. Jeshua is a descendant of the high priest, and therefore he could use them. But since he didn't do it in this case, clearly at this point the stones were lost. And in this verse will be the last time these objects are ever named in Scripture. For the sons of Abiah and Hakos and Barzillai, it means that their status will never be confirmed. They will never be priests again. But here's the hope. Even though the Urim and the Thummim were lost, it was not the last revelation we have received from God. Even if the sons of Abiah and Hakos and Barzillai could never be priests, God would soon raise up a nation of priests. Because it is written in Joel 2 verses 28, that the Spirit of God will come. It will come about after this, that I will pour out my Spirit on all mankind. And your sons and your daughters will prophesy. Your old men will dream dreams, and your young men will see visions. The Urim and the Thummim might be lost, but the faithfulness of God in building his church remains forever. Which brings us to the next point. The faithfulness of God displayed in small numbers. Ezra 2, verses 64 to 67. The whole assembly numbered 42,360. Besides their male and female servants who numbered 7,307. And they had 200 singers, men and women. Their horses were 736. Their mules 245. Their camels 435. Their donkeys 6,720. It's the only time I've ever written a sermon with a calculator. And why is that important? Firstly, as I've pointed out before, these are not a lot of people. Roughly estimates places the total Jewish population in Persia at that time between hundreds and thousands and even 1 million. And yet, at this point, only 42,360 people returned with Ezra. By the third wave of repatriation, only 60,000 Jews, more or less, would ever go back to Judea. Why this is, we can only speculate. Maybe for many, the new life in the Persian Empire was too comfortable. For others, the journey might have been far and dangerous. Or maybe the destruction and the opposition in Jerusalem was too much to bear. But while few returned, God remains faithful in building his church, no matter the small numbers. Secondly, not a lot of people return, and they do not return with much resources. Look at the amount of servants. The ratio of citizen to servant was 6-1. Look at the amount of pack animals. The ratio of citizens to animals was 5-1. Which means that those who returned probably carried their own luggage, and they walked all the way. And while few returned, they brought with them even fewer resources. But God remains faithful in building his church. No matter the numbers, no matter the resources. Because despite the discouragement that there might have been at these few that made the journey, despite the lack of resources, God orchestrates an amazing heart response in the people to the faithfulness of God. And that's point number 7. Tonight we've considered the context of the faithfulness of God. The faithfulness of God towards Judah's leaders. The faithfulness of God towards the everyday covenant people. The faithfulness of God displayed in the ministers of the temple. The faithfulness of God displayed in those with compromised identities. The faithfulness of God displayed in small numbers. And what we see in these final verses is a response of the people to the faithfulness of God. Ezra 2, verses 68 to 69. Some of the heads of the fathers' households, when they arrived at the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem, offered willingly for the house of God to restore it on its foundation. According to their ability, they gave to the treasury for the work 61,000 gold drachmas, 5,000 silver minas, and 100 priestly garments. The response to the faithfulness of God is worship. And it's worship that is expressed in their giving. The express purpose of the people returning here to Jerusalem is worship. They want to rebuild the temple in order to worship. They want to reestablish the sacrificial system in order to worship. They want to observe the feasts once again in order to worship. But the temple is in ruin. And so, at this moment, part of their worship is to give. And that giving is characterized by 2 attitudes. Firstly, their worship of giving is unforced. There's no order given by Ezra. There's no pressure to give. There's no mandate to give. Those who experience the faithfulness of God in building his church simply offered willingly for the house of God to be restored on its foundations. This was not their tithing. The tithing was still obligated. This was not instead of their labor. Believe me, they are going to work very hard to build the temple. But instead, this giving reflects the giving that was last seen at the building of the first temple under Solomon. We read of it in 1 Chronicles 29, verses 9. Then the people rejoiced because they had offered so willingly, for they made their offering to the Lord with a whole heart, and King David also rejoiced greatly. The response to the faithfulness of God, the response by those who have experienced the faithfulness of God, is giving. Giving that is part of worship. And it's giving that is unforced. The second attitude in their giving is giving as worship, and it's unrestricted. There's no minimum requirements. There's no maximum allowance. There's no target to be reached. Those who experience the faithfulness of God in building the church simply gave according to their ability. They gave to the treasury for the work. They simply gave what they could give, and they gave with a willing heart. And they gave what they received in the faithfulness of God, because all that they now have, they received in Ezra 1 verses 6, where we already considered. All those about them encouraged them with articles of silver, with gold, with goods, with cattle, and with valuables, aside from all that was given as a free will offering. But instead of holding on to these blessings, they offered their wealth up for the construction of the temple. And it was quite a lot. 61,000 gold drachmas and 5,000 silver minas and 100 priestly garments, which translate to about 734 million rand in today's money, or 17,000 rands per person that returned. The response to the faithfulness of God is giving as part of worship. And it's giving that is unrestricted. But there is a warning in these verses too. As we read in verse 68, some of the heads of the fathers' households, when they arrived at the house of the Lord, which is in Jerusalem, offered willingly for the house of God to be restored on its foundation. Only some gave a free will offering, but not all. See, all experienced the faithfulness of God, but that experience did not motivate all to give. And that lack of worship in giving will eventually be evident in their lack of worship at all. Haggai writes about this in Haggai 1, verses 1 to 4. In the second year of Darius king, on the first day of the 6th month, the word of the Lord came to the prophet Haggai, to Zerubbabel the son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and to Joshua the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, saying, Thus says the Lord of hosts, this people says, the time has not come, even the time for the house of the Lord to be rebuilt. Then the word of the Lord came by Haggai the prophet, saying, Is it time for you yourselves to dwell in paneled houses, while the house lies desolate? As only some gave unforced and unrestricted in response to the faithfulness of God, others started drifting away from their true purpose in returning. They lost focus. And instead of rebuilding the temple, they rebuilt their homes, and they became comfortable and lazy. They lost focus of the very purpose of their return, which was to worship God. Instead of worshiping God by giving unforced and unrestricted, they spent the money on worshiping themselves in luxury. And we are thereby warned ourselves. The response to the faithfulness of God should be worship in all its forms. And one of those forms of worship is giving, which is unforced. willingly, and unrestricted, according to our ability. But then, and this is our warning, but when there is no response to the faithfulness of God which we have experienced, we too often drift into luxury and laziness, spending it on our own pleasures, not trusting the faithfulness of God to provide again, even though we've experienced it time and time and time again. But we hold on tightly to what we have received. The unwillingness to give is misplaced worship. Because here in the conclusion of Ezra 2, verses 70, we see a wonderful demonstration of God's faithfulness once again. Now the priests and the Levites, some of the people, the singers, the gatekeepers, and the temple servants, lived in their cities, and all Israel in their cities. 70 years of exile, 70 years after great destruction, 70 years of living as a foreigner in a foreign land. God restores his people to their inheritance. And thereby, God demonstrates his faithfulness in building his church. Let us pray. Dear Lord, thank you for the opportunity